Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Camden Town studio of CPH Docs and Conference Day 2, the aptly named Art Technology Change Conference. My name is Mark Atkin, and I'm the Head of Studies of the CPH Lab, which is Docs' program for bringing together creative technologists and artists to develop new forms of expression in documentary. We've been having workshops with lab participants this week, and going to be pitching their projects in partnership with our friends at Kaleidoscope on Thursday afternoon. And God willing, you could be able to see some of their projects in real life at next year's Docs. I'm also director of Crossover Labs, running workshops, facilitating people to create new immersive media projects. In Australia, a parallel universe in a different dimension where people could gather together in large numbers and share head-mounted displays. How could the Art Technology Change Conference not embrace online? We've learned an awful lot about doing this over the past few days that we're going to be happy to share. And I'm sure that some of the practices that we've developed over this week are things that we will retain for the future. In today's conference, we will be looking at how some of the most acute problems besetting us today, social, political, environmental, and health, stem from man putting himself at the center of nature and society. Perhaps now more than ever, it seems timely for us to be thinking about our role within different networks, our relationships to other people, to different species, and to the planet. We'll take you on a journey, starting by looking at the problem with men, moving to exploring our relationship to animals, then to question the very concept of the self. Then we'll move on to solutions. How can we, as a creative community, evoke empathy with the different types of media we create? We'll finish by looking at models of sustainability for immersive producers, all in just 3 hours. Then we'll resume on Thursday morning at 10:30 Central European Time for a special presentation of Javad Alipour's The Brothers Are But Believers, an interactive film about toxic masculinity and the descent into radicalization of vulnerable young men, in which you participate using one of those tools of indoctrination, WhatsApp. This is available only to the first 200 people who sign up to it on the Art Technology Change page of the Docs website, including, of course, your mobile phone number, so we can sign you up to those WhatsApp groups. But back to today. If you're watching this on Facebook, you can post questions for speakers, and our moderators will sort through them and send them to me, because I can't see this on Facebook. We're going to start with a bang, so hold on to your seats. Ashley Johnston is a writer at Do the Green Thing, an organization that uses creativity to tackle climate change. And she's going to kick things off for us by showing us how patriarchy is ruining the planet. Ashley, take it away.
Thanks so much, Mark. Hi, everyone. As Mark said, my name is Ashley Johnston. I'm a writer and editor at Do the Green Thing. We're an environmental charity that's been running since 2007, and we're actually run out of Pentagram Design, the world's oldest and largest independent design consultancy. Since 2007, we've worked with 500 creatives and more now all over the world, including people like David Shrigley, Paula Scher, Vivienne Westwood, Emma Thompson, to make posters, podcasts, products that have inspired millions of people to live more sustainably. Now, I'll start my presentation. There we go. And more recently, we've focused on kind of long form articles that take a look at larger cultural and social forces that have something to do with us sort of stopping living as greener, as sustainably as we could. So most recently, we did something on patriarchy, but I'll just show you a little bit of our back catalog. We developed the world's first carbon calculator for cocaine use. We actually worked with a Columbia economist to create the formula to figure out how much cocaine use affects the planet. We also argued for Glastonbury, the festival, to go meat-free. We've obviously had a few changes in government administration since then, as you can see from the posters. I love eat halloumi and have better tent sex. I think that's great. And we also, last Christmas, created a waste-free alternative to cringy office Secret Santa presents that you should absolutely try for yourself this year. It's called Ungifted, and it's lots of fun. But last year during International Women's Day, we tried to calmly explain the mountain of evidence that shows how patriarchy is ruining the planet. And all the while, reply guys were yelling at us on the internet. And that's the bit I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about today. Not the yelling, but the sort of patriarchy planet bit. I don't know if there are any gender theory PhDs in the audience, but before I go too much further, I just wanted to share the sort of flavor of capitalism and patriarchy that we're sort of talking about. It's what Bell Hooks calls the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. So I'm obviously shortening that to just talk about patriarchy, which has no gender. It's a heteronormative social construct in which men sort of hold power and women are largely excluded from it. So you've all heard about the gender pay gap, I'm sure, but there's also a well-evidenced gap in climate action when it comes to gender. Or maybe to put it in more familiar terms, men are disappointing or can be disappointing. Multiple studies have found that women outperform men across age group, across country, in virtually every type of environmental behavior. Women litter less, they recycle more, they eat less meat, they're more likely to buy an electric car, they're more concerned about the environment and they vote accordingly, and women leave a smaller carbon footprint when they die. I mean, if you look at this Botticelli here, you can't really have a carbon footprint if you're not wearing any clothes and traveling on a shell and that guy is your wind power. But really, why are women such planetary champions when men aren't? Well, it's the patriarchy and its symptoms like sexism and toxic masculinity. Under patriarchy, women and girls are expected to be more selfless, to be more other-oriented, to be more socially responsible than men. We're socialized to value and express empathy more strongly, which prepares us for lives as mothers, teachers, carers, and other underpaid roles in society. But those same altruistic impulses, they mean that women are more likely to make choices to help protect the planet for future generations. And at the same time, there's research that suggests that men who are also influenced by patriarchy and toxic masculinity, well, they may reject eco-friendly behavior for the exact same reason, because environmental altruism and selflessness makes men feel less macho, and they fear that green actions will brand them as sensitive or feminine. So I'll share a few examples and experiments in which male participants managed to demonstrate just how sensitive they could be about, well, their own masculinity. In one experiment, men said they were more likely to donate to environmental charities with a masculine logo, something maybe black or dark blue, featuring a howling wolf with a name like Wilderness Rangers in block letters, rather than a charity called Friends of Nature with an image of a tree and maybe some green and tan colors in the logo. In another experiment, both male and female participants agreed that single-use plastic bags, the kind of bags you get at a grocery store, were more masculine than bringing a reusable canvas bag to the grocery store. So apparently plastic bags are gendered. The researchers in these studies conclude that if green feminine stereotypes stop men from taking environmentally friendly actions, then we should actually consider using masculine affirmation and more manly branding of environmental products as a way to narrow that gender gap in climate action. They actually use the words men environmentally friendly, but I didn't really want to dwell on that. And actually here are the researchers in their own words. So basically, the survival of our species is being held hostage by fragile masculinity. I don't think that's so great. But even though women are proven to be the real planetary champions, as climate change intensifies everywhere, leading to extreme weather, to water scarcity, to crop failure, food insecurity, and so much more, it is women, and predominantly poor women of color, who will suffer climate change's most harmful effects. Because climate change is also sexist. It is women who make up 80% of people displaced by climate change. It is women who are 14 times more likely to die during a natural disaster because information is often sort of transmitted by men to other men in public spaces, and women tend to be at home caring for children or the elderly. Women are also less likely to be able to swim. After the 2004 tsunami, a report found that surviving men outnumbered women by almost 3 to 1 in Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and India for that reason. As dry seasons extend and lakes disappear, it is also women in rural developing communities who are forced to work harder, to walk further, and to put their health at risk to feed and care for their families. And it is women who are more likely to be poor, making it more difficult for them to recover from disasters because they're the ones that are often left unemployed, overburdened with domestic work, and vulnerable to sexual violence and exploitation. Climate change disproportionately affects women and girls precisely because women and girls are already more marginalized in our society. In a patriarchal world, climate change simply magnifies the existing inequalities within it. This is, at least to me, it only compounds the outrage over continued apathy about gender inequality and climate change. And it's why calls for gender responsive climate action and climate justice, as well as racial justice, are becoming more urgent. In the face of grave climate predictions, we must find ways to distribute more power and resources to women and people of color, not just suffering. And so, well, where do we start? Not that. And probably not that either. Maybe something more like this. This painting is actually called Truth Coming Out of Her Well to Shame Mankind. And while accurate in this context, what I'm actually talking about is representation. Women are often the eco-moral leaders of their families and communities, and yet at every level of decision-making, from major international organizations to grassroots activism, women's voices, ideas, energy, they're all underrepresented, undervalued, and taken for granted. As you can see, women are still a minority on virtually every major committee of the United Nations' own top climate change decision-making group, the FCCC. Women account for just over 20% of the authors on recent reports for the International Panel on Climate Change, the world's leading scientific body on climate change. When the IPCC actually first published its report in 1990, only 2% of the authors were women. And women account for less than 30% of most major national and global climate change bodies as well. And 70% of the presidents and board chairs of US environmental groups are men. Women-led community initiatives often miss out on vital climate financing and grants because their projects aren't considered large enough. But if women smallhold farmers were given the same access to credit and tools as their male counterparts, they could grow 20 to 30% more food on the same amount of land, cutting 2 billion tons of emissions by 2050. Women are on the front lines of climate change. Their perspectives are vital as governments develop the laws and policies that will shape our global response to it. We already know that countries with more women in parliament are more likely to ratify international environmental treaties, and engaging a critical mass of women in any sector is linked to more progressive and positive outcomes in business, and also more sustainably focused decision making. Silencing or excluding women from climate change will only serve to choke off opportunities to find solutions and will squander our last chance to avoid, well, a climate hellscape. But this isn't about pathologizing masculinity or blaming individual men for their role in accelerating climate change, even though one or two probably deserve some major side eye. It's about recognizing this complicated and connected set of facts. That men are beneficiaries of a pernicious power structure, that is the patriarchy, that has long oppressed women and sought to dominate the natural world. And that men are also influenced by and victims themselves of gendered social expectations like toxic masculinity that lead them to make choices that harm the environment. Indeed, the American Psychological Association recently issued new guidelines that frame masculinist ideology or toxic masculinity as bad for men's physical and mental health, and obviously bad for the planet too. And that when those two things are compounded over hundreds of years and billions of people, well, then it probably has contributed to the acceleration of climate change on Earth and to the disproportionate suffering of the women who live on it. What the data shows is that the chronic and cumulative effects of patriarchy isn't only bad for the culture, it's bad for the planet too. It's a reflection of our unsustainable power structures and economic models that need to change if we want to have a hope of surviving. Because patriarchy is a pyramid scheme, capitalism is a pyramid scheme, climate change denial is a pyramid scheme. It privileges a few at the top and puts the burden on those below, harming everyone and everything else. And by exploring this issue in particular at Do the Green Thing, we wanted to reveal the sort of gendered dimensions of climate change, to its causes, to its consequences, and to its solutions as well. And last year, we put together an exhibition inviting 30 women and non-binary artists from around the world to respond to this issue, to this idea of patriarchy and the planet and that dynamic. And their responses really reflect the range of experience of living under patriarchy in a time of climate crisis. And I'll share some of them with you today. So this is Mary Lou Farr's illustration that sort of shows the complete exasperation of women. Don't let the world burn. This piece by Ngadi Smart did the thing I so hoped an artist would do, and she put a bunch of dicks emitting pollution in her gorgeous piece. Laura Jordan Bombach and Maisie May Plumstead playfully toyed with the idea of gender stereotypes by making these macho recycling bins. This is just a photo of them, but they were created for real. And it would reward men with burps and farts when they used them. It's sort of the gender affirmation idea that the scientists and researchers were talking about. This beautiful photography from Anastasia Kosteleva really illustrates the dangerous sea level rise in small island states like the Maldives. As I said, women and children make up the majority of deaths from water-related disasters, in part because they're less likely to be able to swim. And the Turner Prize winning group Assemble, as well as Jade Gerard, who was the model maker behind Wes Anderson's film The Isle of Dogs, both center the idea of home in their pieces as one of women's sources of power in the fight against climate change. This beautiful illustration by Syrian artist Hannah Kudsi considers the effects of armed conflict on women and the environment, because of course a more militarized society also leads to greater environmental destruction, unfortunately. Kristen Smith thinks about other ways women have power and voice in the fight against climate change in her piece called Seats at Every Table. And these prints from Sophie Thomas, that taking quotes actually from Greta Thunberg's speech, I Want You to Panic, go really well with this series from Lizzie Reed, Sounding the Alarm. And actually in this piece from Lizzie Reed, the names Deirdre, Peggy, and Jane are all names of storms in 2019. The data shows people prepare less when a storm has a feminine name and therefore are more likely to die or get hurt. Artist and activist Wong Kai-ying made these fabulous badges for us. And the artist collective Guerrilla Girls bring the energy and urgency of activism to their piece as well, from 1994, but it's just as relevant today. And this was actually created on a plastic bag. You can see all of the works on the dedicated website. It's called manmadedisaster.art. Please go take a look and you can read more about their work as well. And there's plenty more that I didn't share today. I suppose together, the artists really are expressing rage, sadness, humor, hope. They show us the world we've created and start to offer a new version of what could be. And it's made us realize something at Do the Green Thing too, why we've got a bit more of an edge and urgency to our work these days, and why we're choosing to focus on bigger structural issues like patriarchy rather than individual actions. And that's because there's just nothing morally neutral anymore. There are no sidelines to sit on in this game. They're all flooded by ice melt. If we aren't doing enough to address climate change or dismantle the patriarchy or dismantle white supremacy, then we're part of the problem. Culture and art, I don't think, is meant to anesthetize us to our reality, especially when we've got a decade to save the planet. This issue, this exhibition, it's meant to be thorny, to feel a little uncomfortable. That's the role of Do the Green Thing. And I think it's also the role of artists and cultural creators more broadly. We're here to expose, to explore and understand the true painful extent of the problem, because unfortunately, the pain is the point to start with. So first pain, then we need to get on with a plan and do that together. Because just as the fight against patriarchy is not only a woman's fight, the fight to curb climate change and save the planet is not one-sided either. There's no way we'll ever be able to robustly fight climate change if we have to handle men's egos with kid gloves, trying to woo and cajole them into making choices that will benefit everyone. What we choose to do now together will have profound consequences for us all. And it's really not lost on me that, this idea of empathy and social action and collective action is something that we're all experiencing under the coronavirus crisis at the moment as well. So maybe we can start by teaching kids that single-use plastic bags really aren't for girls or boys. They're just for assholes. Thank you. That is me.
Ashley, thank you very much. Now, to you and to people tuning in, because for the first half of your talk, despite all of our tech rehearsals, we didn't have your slides.
Oh, forgive me.
Which is kind of heartbreaking because they're so beautifully produced because you are a design agency, but it made perfect sense anyway, what you were saying. And it's very kind of timely call to action, really. I've got a question for you, which is, this was originally sort of published through Do the Green Thing, and you had your exhibition as well. What was the response to it when you put those things out?
To be honest with you, it was really difficult to even get the early permissions to publish the piece, in part because the way Do the Green Thing works, we sit within another business. And so it was it made people feel nervous that this business was going to sort of receive negative responses. And that was a little bit challenging. And so it just took it took a journey, really. And we just, once we shared the evidence, this is not, this isn't a guess. This is an aggregate of a lot of evidence from around the world. And once people see it as fact, it becomes a little bit less scary, I think, for people. And those knee-jerk reactions that are so easy to do online and on places like Twitter, where you're anonymous, are less easy to do once you actually see the evidence and you talk to the people who know more about it. So we eventually got people on side, but it did take a little while. It's just one of those things where, unfortunately, these things are considered controversial, and really they're not. And if we're not brave enough to expose some of these really cultural problems, we're not going to be smart enough to solve them.
So what is Do the Green Thing doing at the moment? And then how can people also follow what you're doing?
Sure. So Do the Green Thing's been around for a long time, and we've had lots of different guises. What we started to try to do in 2007 was focus on individual actions, in part because that was sort of where the climate movement was at the time. So we had a group of climate experts give us advice on what people could do most usefully within their own lives. So we focused on things like turning off lights, taking your bike, turning off water, etc. And then that felt less and less relevant as the crisis sort of worsened. And right now we're in a moment, I think, where the responsibility is really laddering up to elected officials, to major corporations, and our role is, I think, increasingly to leverage or pressure people to expect more and demand more from the systems that we've put in place, and change the systems where we can. I'm currently quarantining myself, and Do the Green Thing's next issue will be about living under quarantine and trying to find ways to sort of explore a more environmental way of living in your own home, whether that's less food waste, it's less broadband time, etc. But please come to our website, take a look, and you can again see the whole man-made disaster exhibit at manmadedisaster.art as well.
dothegreenthing.com, is it?
It is.
Great, good. Yes, and I thoroughly recommend it. It's one of those sort of rare examples of something about climate change which is really stylish, witty, amusing, dynamic. And we'll be looking out for your next article there.
Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Ashley. All the best. So now we need to reset for the next talk. So we'll see you back. Bye for now. Eva Meyer is an artist, writer, philosopher, and singer-songwriter. She's the author of a recent book called Animal Languages and believes that we should change our relationship to animals since animals talk and we should listen. I just want to point out that Eva's not using any slides in this talk, so if you don't see any slides, that's planned this time. Eva, would you like to take it away?
Thank you, Mark, and many thanks to the organization for allowing this event to happen in this digital way. Hello, everybody. I hope you are doing well in this strange time. Hi, Mom, if you're watching. Okay, today I'm going to be speaking about animals. When it comes to non-human animals, we live in paradoxical times. Due to human impact on ecosystems, non-human animals, and the planet, our age has been named the Anthropocene, the age of the human. This Anthropocene has shaped the knowledge and technology for humans to realize that other animals have agency, that they act, that they have cultures, that they have emotions and complex inner lives. But at the same time, it also is an epoch in which their agency is increasingly curtailed. This leads to problems for them, but the conditions that led to the Anthropocene also created problems for humans. Think only of the current climate crisis or the pandemic that we are facing now. But I will get back to that later. Let's begin with the prairie dogs. Prairie dogs live in tunnels under the ground, and they do not leave their village at all, a bit like people who spend their whole time in the same village. Which makes it very easy for predators to locate where they are. And the prairie dogs always need to get out of their tunnel system in order to be able to eat. So the predators just wait near the exit of one of their tunnels and wait for them to come out. The prairie dogs have developed a very complex system of warning calls, alarm calls. They use different sounds to describe different types of predators. So in their sounds, they, for example, tell each other whether or not predators are coming from the sky or if they are coming from the ground. And this is necessary because they need to know that in order to know how to react. But the prairie dogs, however, do not stop there. When a human being enters their territory, they tell each other that it's a human approaching. They tell each other how tall they are, what kind of color hair they have, what kind of color t-shirt they have, and if they are carrying something with them, such as, for example, a bag or an umbrella or a gun. Prairie dogs also do this when other animals walk onto their territory, such as, for example, dogs. So they tell each other, oh, there's a dog approaching. They tell each other about the size of the dog, the color of the dog, and also if this is a familiar dog or a new one. Prairie dogs are a species of ground squirrel, so they're not actual dogs, and they communicate by using small sounds, like a bit like guinea pig sounds. And in these sounds, you find a sort of grammar. So the meaning of their sentences changes when the elements change. So when the sounds have a different position in the sentence, the meaning changes. Which functions like grammar in human language. And these prairie dogs can also make new combinations with these sentences, such as, for example, in one of the experiments, they told each other that there was an oval unknown object coming from the sky, because the researchers had made oval things that came from above. Now, the prairie dogs also have a form of social chatter that we do not know much about, and they have a sort of wave, which is called the jump yip. So this involves throwing their hands up in the air and doing a little backward jump while yelling yip. And this is something they do out of enthusiasm. They, for example, do it when a predator, such as a snake, leaves their territory. Now, the language of prairie dogs is not unique. What is unique is that it has been studied so well. There was a Russian-American biologist, Kon Slobodchikov, and he has been studying the prairie dog's language for over 25 years now. And this is not true for many of the other animal species. So many species have complex languages, but these are not researched yet. We do know a lot of things about like one specific aspect of an animal's language. Say, for example, names. Dolphins have names. They have signature whistles that they use to introduce themselves into a group. Parrots have names. They apparently name their children. We know that bats use names, and bats argue a lot, and it turns out that they really like to gossip. So when they argued with one of the bats and that bat flew away, you can hear them talk about that bat for a very long time. Another aspect of language is a grammar, which is seen as very important for human language, and we find that in the languages of many other animals. For example, the songs of birds. But here it is also important to notice that while for us, language is really connected to sound, for many other animals, it may involve color or sense or even movements. And when we are thinking about grammar, there are, for example, insects and also bees who communicate by using scents. And these scents are composed of different elements. And when this composition of the elements changes, their meaning changes. And some biologists think that this also works like grammar. There's also a species of lizard that uses grammar in their body movements. So the precise shape of their body actually determines what they are saying, and this follows the logic of language, of grammar, perhaps. So all of these studies show that animals have more complex forms of communication than we thought before, and of course they understand each other well. But there's also a lot of communication possible between humans and other animals, especially with domesticated animals. Humans have a long shared history with many non-human animal species, which has influenced our capacities for understanding one another. Horses, for example, can be taught to use symbols, but horses are also really good at directing humans into the right direction, and the humans don't know that they are being directed into that direction simply by using head movements. Cats began to meow in order to draw their humans' attention. dogs have started to bark when they began to live with humans. And there are even some biologists who think that humans have begun to use language because they were living together with dogs. But that's a very contested claim. We do know in the context of humans and dogs that dogs and humans understand each other pretty well. So human beings who did not grow up with dogs and have no dogs in their close surroundings will still be able to interpret their moods correctly when they hear them bark or growl on tape. And the same also applies the other way around. Dogs know, can judge humans' emotions on the basis of photographs or sound recordings. And it is even the case that when dogs and humans who know each other well, who are good friends, look into each other's eyes, they both create the cuddle hormone oxytocin, something that also happens between human lovers or between dogs or between parents and babies. Now, there are a lot of empirical studies that investigate how animals express themselves, how they communicate with one another, and how they communicate with humans. These studies raise many questions, including a lot of philosophical questions. So, of course, they raise questions about the animals, about their inner lives, what they think, because language is, of course, closely interconnected with thinking. How you express yourself shows what goes on in your mind. And it also involves a lot of questions about our treatment of the other animals, because we are treating them pretty horribly at the moment, and the fact that they speak back, that they think about us, that they speak about us. Chickens, for example, name the humans with whom they live. All of that matters when you think of sharing a planet with others. But it also raises a lot of questions concerning the human and the distinction between humans on one side and other animals on the other side. Because in the philosophical tradition, language was for a very long time seen as a very important characteristic, or even the defining characteristic of humans. And we still see that in especially philosophy of language, where there's very often a distinction being made between humans on the one hand side, so humans use language, and animals on the other side. Animals communicate with each other. But as we saw, all of these new empirical studies actually really challenge that, because all the things that we see as specific for human language are in some sense also found in the languages of other animals, even abstract concepts. It's, for example, thought that elephants communicate about death with each other. And that's very challenging for human exceptionalism. For that reason, the question of whether or not animals speak, whether or not they use language, is not simply one that can be solved by more empirical research, because usually research questions in a certain time period reflect ideas about animals in that time. And we see that very clearly in the history of animal language research. So in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a lot of attention for non-human animals and language. But the thing is, these animals were only used to study certain questions about the foundation of human language. So non-human primates and dolphins were used, and the researchers tried to get them to speak in human language. There were, for example, a couple of famous studies where very young chimpanzees were raised together with human children in families of researchers, and then there was a comparison between the human child and the chimpanzee child to see whether or not they had the same capacity for language, and so on. Of course, these studies can tell us something about these other animals. They tell us something about how attuned they can be to animals of other species, and they tell us something about their capacity for imitation, or their desire to have contact in surroundings that are very strange to them. But it doesn't tell us a whole lot about their ways of using language, because when you investigate an animal's capacity to speak by asking her to speak in human language, for animals of many species, you are not going to get very far. I mean, for bees, that's not going to work. So instead, we need to be open to the different forms that language can have in different species. And approaching animal expressions as language can actually be very enlightening in certain species. An example is the Caribbean reef squid. These are squid that live on the bottom of the ocean, and they communicate with changing color patterns on the side of their body. So they have little cells that contain pigment, and they can change the color of these cells by releasing or contracting certain muscles. And these squid communicate with others all the time. So they're, for example, able to flirt with another squid on one side of their body. So they see a squid they like, and they say something like, "Hey, how are you?" I don't know what they say precisely. And then the other squid can flirt back or not, or say no. I think saying no is something like the zebra print that's becoming darker and darker and darker. And at the same time, the first squid can talk to others who come from the other side. They can, for example, say, "Listen, I'm flirting, back off now." These color patterns are really complex, and they move really fast, so they're very difficult for us to follow. And certain biologists have decided to study them as if they are a language. And it turns out they function exactly like a language. The squid have verbs and nouns and adverbs. And by approaching their language as language, this enabled the biologists to get a much better grasp on their behavior, while at the same time getting a very different view of language and what language could mean. Of course, in the meantime, the reef squid understood each other perfectly. So, if we want to find out more about non-human animals and language, we need to ask the right questions, and we also need to learn how to listen to them. This project is also very much a political project in many ways. I will discuss some here. First of all, excluding other animals from language installs a hierarchy. It creates a distinction between the humans that speak and the other animals that are silent, at least in the ways that are important. The French philosopher Derrida argues that this even happens within language. By having a word, animal, that captures all the other animals except humans, we make it seem as if there is a gap between humans on the one hand side and all of the other animals on the other side. This also flattens all the difference of these other animals. It groups them together in a way that doesn't do justice to how different they are from each other. And it also exaggerates the distance between humans and these other animals, because we are much closer to some species biologically, such as primates, than to others, such as small spiders. And we are closer to some species socially, such as the domesticated animals I spoke about before, than animals who live on the bottom of the ocean and we never usually encounter. And this difference, this hierarchy, can then lead to violence in the outside world. So how we think about animals, how we speak about them, how we speak about them speaking, is very interconnected with how we think, how we treat them. And many ancient philosophical ideas about animals as machines are still very prominent, for example, in laboratories where they are used for experiments. But the question of animal language and learning to listen to other animals is also political in another way. And that is because political agency, being able to act politically, is in the philosophical tradition always interconnected with language. So in order to be able to act politically or have a political voice, you need to be able to speak. And this view actually has really long and deep roots in this philosophical tradition. We already find it in the work of Aristotle, who famously wrote that humans are the only true political animals. And he connected this to the ability to speak. Of course, animals have voices, Aristotle said, but they do not have this rationally informed type of language, or logos, he called that humans have. And this is needed for being a political actor and for being a member of the political community. This view of Aristotle is actually still very much common sense. So in many political practices, all of our political institutions, we find that it's simply accepted that other animals are not political actors, and nobody gives that a second thought. The same applies to current political philosophy. So all political philosophers on different theoretical sides of the spectrum think that language and politics are so interconnected and animals do not speak, so they can never be political agents. But of course, this is changing now because there is all of this new research. There's also another trend in political philosophy that's challenging specific conceptions of the human, but I won't really go into that now. But let's stick to the research. So that is challenging the idea of the human as being separate from other animals, and it's challenging the idea of the other animal as being incapable of speech, incapable of expressing themselves. And in philosophy, animals are mostly studied in ethics, where people think about how we should treat other animals. Can we eat them? Can we wear them? Can we hold them captive their whole lives? But in that field, it's still very much a question of humans thinking about other animals. And in political philosophy, the questions are somewhat different. So there it's much more a question of what kind of relationships there are between different groups. And this also is a very fruitful lens to look at relations between humans and other animals. So in recent years, there has been a political turn in animal philosophy. This meant that certain political philosophers are now thinking about our relations with the other animals. Many of these philosophers argue that for democratic reasons, we should take into account the interests of other animals in our processes of decision making, because we as humans influence most aspects of their lives. I mean, this applies to domesticated animals that we keep in stables or in households, but also to wild animals, because we are using their habitats in many different ways. We're using the sky and the sea and all of these spaces on land. So these philosophers say that we influence the lives of other animals, and therefore they have interests. We should take their interests into account. It's a democratic principle. The interests of all that are affected should be taken into account in democratic decision making. But some philosophers go farther, and they actually argue that animals exercise political agency, that they should be seen as political actors. They resist, they cooperate with humans, they guard their territories, they are engaged in different types of power relations with human beings in different spaces. For example, the work of Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka is very interesting in this regard. If people want to read more, their book Zoopolis develops a political theory of animal rights in which they argue that some animals should be seen as members of shared societies, others should be seen as sovereign communities, and others as a sort of denizens, animals who live amongst us but who are not part of our communities. Now, this focus on political relationships turns us back to the question of language. Because if we are going to reformulate our societies together with other animals, and remember, we share a planet with all of these other animals, we cannot separate ourselves from them, and they have a perspective on the world as well. So for normative reasons, we should listen to them and engage with them differently. This means we also need to think about language, because language is a bridge between different worlds. It can distance us from others, but it can also bring us closer. And this is relevant not just for the other animals. I began this talk by saying that this is a very paradoxical time in terms of relations with other animals, but it's also a very paradoxical time for humans, because we humans, at least we humans in the global north, have benefited from human exceptionalism. Our whole consumer culture is built on that. But on the other hand, our distancing ourselves from the other animals and our use of the planet has led to the ecological collapse that is looming, and that began in certain ways. A great loss of biodiversity is a good example. In all of that, our lives are thoroughly intertwined with those with the lives of those other animals. Our way of consuming leads to loss of their habitats and even their extinction. And even the pandemic that we are experiencing now is connected to the lives of other animals. It began as a disease in animals, and many of the pandemics of the last years are zoonoses, so diseases that spring from animals to humans, and the rise of them is interconnected with deforestation and the loss of animal habitat, so that wild animals are forced to go into human communities or are eaten by humans, together with intensive animal farming that makes it very easy for diseases to spread. So our health is also connected with theirs. And in learning to live differently, we can look at the other animals who are better at using natural resources and leaving natural resources for others. And it's also really important to notice that a lot of people think that treating animals differently, going vegan, all of that is a loss, that you need to give up something. But I think the opposite is true, because understanding that we share the world with many others and treating from them and learning from them and making this a better place for everybody actually makes for a much richer life. So we can do it differently, and we should.
Thank you very much, Eva. My brain's spinning now with what you're saying. And people say things like they don't want to eat octopuses because they think they're really smart. And basically what you're saying now is actually all animals are much more intelligent in a way that we normally understand intelligence than we normally give them credit. And we're going through this sort of interesting era at the moment with the rise of artificial intelligence, where people are talking quite seriously about giving rights to machines because they feel that they can think and communicate with us. And it seems to me as though we haven't even got to that stage yet with animals. Now, it's fascinating, and I'm dying to talk to you more about this, but we're actually out of time.
Oh, sorry.
And we need to now reset for the next speaker who's going to come in and sort of take this kind of conversation a little bit further by looking at the multitude of different networks that we're involved in, including with other species. But thank you so much. It was really, really fascinating. And can you tell people where they can find your book?
Yeah, I have a website, evameijer.nl, and the book is called Animal Languages, or When Animals Speak. That's an academic book that came out recently, and people can just buy it everywhere. But please go to your local bookstore and buy it there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, bye everyone. I'll see you again in a minute as we reset. Bye now. Tom Oliver is Professor of Applied Ecology at the University of Reading and author of The Self-Delusion, The Surprising Science of How We Are Connected and Why That Matters. That will make you think differently about yourself and your place in the world. And perhaps now more than ever, this is a book for our times. Take it away, Tom.
Thank you, Mark. So hopefully you can all see the slides. Thanks for having me here. As Mark said, I suppose in these times of global pandemic, our interconnectedness is becoming increasingly clear, and also the importance of maintaining social connectedness as well, of course. So even though we can't be physically together, those social connections are hugely important. So I'm glad you're all joining today, and I'll get started. So we evolved from single-celled bacteria-like organisms, just like all the other species you see here. But we humans often now feel that we're above or beyond nature in some way. When you look at a natural scene like this, do you see nature out there, or do you see yourself somehow reflected in that scene? Now, this question may seem a little abstract, but it's crucially important for our personal and our planetary health. So how can we tackle this subject? I could ask, what is the self? But that's a bit too abstract. So we're going to start something a bit more tangible. Right now, you're all at your individual computers connecting remotely. But I just want you to imagine that we're all in the same room. So a room full of people. Down, sure. So, okay, hopefully you can hear me a little bit better now without the feedback. So I want you to imagine that we're all in the same room together. So full of people. That's how I like to imagine my talks, even if they aren't always like that really. Bustling with people in a big grand conference hall in Copenhagen. And I'm going to ask a question here. I'm going to say, how many people here have picked their nose in the last month? Please raise your hand. And I want you to imagine what it would feel like to have to put up your hand in that room. Some people might be fine raising their hands, but I imagine there's quite a few people. I might see their arms tentatively moving, but a bit, worried about putting them in the air. I mean, how would that question make you feel in a room full of people, if you can imagine it? Perhaps a little bit anxious or vulnerable. And that's not surprising or embarrassed, because we have a self-image, a reputation to maintain. A large part of our sense of self is the narrative based on how we think others will perceive us. And we don't want to be the type of person who puts their hand up in a room and admits to even a minor social taboo. But equally, how does it feel to always have to uphold this sense of self, to defend it and protect it, like there's a fortress with a little me inside and almost 8 billion others out there? Does that ever feel draining or isolating or even lonely? Now, loneliness has been increasing in the modern world. In many developed countries, anxiety has been increasing, rates of self-harm amongst adolescents, depression. In the UK, for example, 16% of adults, that's 1 in 6 adults, take antidepressants. And some have described this as a mental health epidemic. I hope to, at least start to convince you that when you look at the science, you start to see that we don't need to feel lonely ever again. But first, let's consider the nature of illusion. So many of you may be familiar with this illusion. It's called the infinite staircase, or Penrose steps, after its creator Roger Penrose. It was also made more famous by the artist M.C. Escher in these beautiful black and white line drawings. And what you can do is, you can put your finger on the screen here on the bottom step, well, the one nearest to you, and follow the stairs up to the right, and then they turn a corner and then they head up, and then they turn again, and they're still going up. They turn, and one more time back to where you started. Now we know you can't keep going upstairs in a circle and come back to where you started, and this is the nature of the illusion. And this illusion is. Our sense of self, I would argue, is a sense of self as a discrete, independent, autonomous entity is a similar illusion. And in both of these cases, the infinite staircase and our sense of self as being independent and discrete, sometimes we might rationally comprehend that truth, but then we turn away and we get distracted. And when we look back, it's snapped back to perceiving the illusion again. And that's because our minds have evolved to perceive the world in a certain way. With regards to our sense of self, when we evolved in pre-modern times, it would have been beneficial to have a sense of self. I mean, of course, it still is beneficial to have some kind of sense of self. In those pre-modern times, having a sense of individuality would be important. It would help us to collate our memories into a coherent set of memories, so we can remember how and where to find food. It would help us to track the complex social interactions as part of our groups. But if we were to take that sense of individualistic self too far and become, selfish, self-centered, if I was to, steal food from the group I was in, or to spoil the camp, these are small groups, everyone's watching, monitoring each other, I'd be punished. I'd be physically beaten or excluded from mating, or even thrown out of the group, threatening my own survival. So you can see there's a series of checks and balances that would, maintain a sense of individuality, but also maintaining the sense of cooperative, collaborative, collective sense of identity as well. Now let's zoom forward to the modern world and think of our group sizes now, where we interact, globally. I mean, many of you are in, I'm probably thousands of miles away from you right now. We interact with people across the world. Our economies are globalized. You know, I can buy something. Well, if I could get to the shops, I could buy something and look at the product, and you know, the impacts ripple across the world. If that product has unsustainable palm oil, then that will lead ultimately to the destruction of rainforests in Indonesia, for example, damaging habitats for species like orangutans, and even causing social impacts as well. And these choices ripple across the world, and they accumulate, multiplied 8 billion times all of our collective actions. They create these vast tidal waves of environmental destruction, and that's leading to climate change, to biodiversity loss, to ocean acidification, to air pollution. You know, the list goes on. And these environmental impacts are threatening now our very future prosperity, and that's not a very sensible thing to do. So this trait, this individualistic sense of self, you know, evolved in an early time when it was beneficial, but arguably now in the modern world, with our huge globalized economies, you know, our moral systems and our legal systems haven't globalized at the same rate. So, you know, when I buy those unsustainable products, you know, I'm doing harm, but no one's going to, you know, it's not illegal, and no one's going to really look down upon me. So, you know, the group sizes are much larger now, and we don't have that same controls on, you know, to ensure those checks and balances, to ensure that collectivism. Now, an analogy here is actually, you know, a trait which evolved, you know, in prehistoric times and is now maladaptive or detrimental, is our tendency to crave sugary or fatty foods. Now, when we evolved, obviously, seeking out those high energy food sources would be really beneficial. But actually, in the modern world, when those food sources are super available and apparent and pushed on us by our marketing and our advertising, you know, the result is an obesity crisis where there are 2 billion people, that's over a quarter of the world's population, obese or overweight, while at the same time you've got another 2 billion malnourished in some way. So you can see here a trait that evolved under a modern context can become detrimental. And in this case, crucially, is exacerbated by culture, in this case, the advertising culture. Now, let's think about our sense of self as a discrete individuals. As I mentioned, it evolved in those early times, and it too has been exacerbated by our culture. Now, our minds, you know, our minds are surrounded by culture. They swim in it, and we soak it up like a sponge, and it determines how we think and who we are ultimately. And our modern cultures, you know, our education systems, encouraging us to build self-esteem or to sell ourselves as a personal brand. Our advertising, you know, saying, you know, you're worth it. And even our governments. In the UK, we had Margaret Thatcher, who famously told the country that there's no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. Now, all these factors combine, all these cultural factors combine and push our sense of self ever further along that continuum, away from a collective, more cooperative sense of self-identity towards this much more self-centered, individualistic identity. And as I mentioned, this is, you know, causing these huge environmental problems. So I think it's time to really challenge that illusion that we are discrete individuals, and you know, look at some of the scientific evidence behind that to really break through that illusion. So let me just give you some of that evidence now. Let's take a moment. I want you to get some energy up. It's straight after lunch, perhaps for some of you. Let's take a deep breath, and you know, feel the back of your chair as you breathe in, and take a deep breath out. And then we're going to do one more, a deep lungful, and out. So when you take that big lungful, what are you breathing in there? I mean, obviously you're breathing in air, but the composition of that air. So it has elements in oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide. It also has, you know, pollution, perhaps plastic microfibers, you know, nitrous oxides from car exhausts, but also organic particles. So we shed from our bodies about 1 million particles every hour. So when you take a breath in, you're breathing in bits of other people's bodies who are in the room before you or in the room now. You're also breathing in molecules that were once part of plants and dinosaurs and sharks and turtles. So let me explain. As you sit there now or stand, there are about 40 to 50 kilograms of oxygen in your body. the reason we don't all float around the rooms, which would be quite fun, is because that oxygen is bound with hydrogen, and the close intermolecular forces between those water molecules maintain the density in our bodies. But when our bodies die and those bonds start to dissipate, when we're buried or if we're cremated, those bonds start to break apart and those molecules start to separate and burst forth. So let's just imagine that now. Let's imagine that the molecules in your body were to burst forth into the sky, well, out of the room, they creep out the cracks of the window, they burst into the atmosphere, and they spread around the entire Earth. So the molecules that were in your body, 40 to 50 kilograms, spread around the entire atmosphere of the Earth, 100 kilometers high. I just want you to think how far apart each of those molecules might be. So 40 to 50 kilograms of oxygen has exploded out of your body and is now spread amongst that entire atmosphere. Well, it turns out those molecules would be about 0.3 millimeters apart. So you could take a cubic meter, that's 1 meter cube, and from anywhere in the atmosphere, and there would be 27 million molecules of oxygen that were once part of your body. So a dense fog of molecules, and that's mixing with a dense fog of molecules that were once part of other bodies, of turtles, sharks, dinosaurs, frogs, wallabies, birds. Take a deep breath. You're breathing in a zoological legacy. You're also breathing in bacteria, because of course there are lots of bacteria in and on our bodies. You've probably heard of the bacteria in our gut, and you know that it can affect our moods and our behaviors, again detracting from our supposed individual autonomy. Now, these bacteria are also elsewhere in our body. In between our elbow joints, we have about 400 species of bacteria. Open your mouth, there are about 1,000 species of bacteria there. Behind our ears, there are about 125 species, depending on how often you wash. Now, of course, there are also bacteria on our skin, and when we shed those bacteria into the air and we breathe them in as well. In fact, those bacteria, you can take a sample of air around you now, and you can do some quite advanced DNA analysis, and you'll find that there's a unique fingerprint, a unique microbial fingerprint that is distinct to you. It's your individual microbial signature. So when you're breathing in, you're breathing in other people's bacteria as well. But you know, don't feel that they're so alien to us, really. I mean, obviously, we're closely related to these bacteria. I mean, we're closely related to each other. You know, even though we sit on different countries or even continents, we share about 99.9% of our genetic code with each other right now. You've probably read that we share about 95% with chimpanzees. But actually, we share 37% with bacteria. So if you hold your hand out right now, floating in the air above your hand are thousands or millions of bacteria. And these bacteria have about 37% of the same DNA, not just similar, but the same genetic code that's in you is also in these bacteria. So they're not so different to us. And actually, every one of our human cells, so we have 38 trillion bacterial cells in our body, and 37 trillion human cells. So the bacteria cells outnumber us in our body. But even in each one of those 37 trillion human cells, we have mitochondria. Now, these are the powerhouses of the cell. They allow us to, you know, produce energy to move around. But these mitochondria evolved from single-celled bacteria that were then engulfed by another cell and became the multicellular animals that we are derived from. So, you know, our human bodies are densely connected with these bacteria. We're a chimera. We're interwoven, human and bacteria. So hopefully, I'm starting to convince you, I hope, that our bodies are, you know, strongly physically connected with the world around us. It's very difficult to just draw, you know, a distinct line around the self. It would be a very fuzzy, indistinct boundary. And you know, when we stand in the mirror, you know, our bodies, each of our cells, you know, is with us just a few weeks or maybe months. Our body's essentially made anew every few months. But what it is that keeps it looking like you when you stand in the mirror is your DNA, and it's the instructions in that genetic code that build a body scavenged from materials in the environment. But that DNA is simply borrowed from our ancestors and we'll pass it on to our ancestors to come. And of course, we share that DNA, as I've said, with each other and with the rest of the web of life. So physically, there is no distinct self. But what about mentally? I mean, in our heads, surely, that's me, isn't it? That defines me in my head. But actually, our brains are closely linked. I mean, every word, every touch, every pheromone that we receive from others alters the neural networks in our brains and changes the person that we are. So you're not the same person that you were 1 year ago, but equally you're not the same person that you were when you woke up this morning, or even when we started this talk. And the new science of social networks is showing how ideas, beliefs, preferences flow so fluidly between social networks that it's very difficult to say, where one mind ends and another begins. We can influence people, their music, their taste in music, their voting choices, their risk of obesity without even meeting them. So our minds are not these, discrete kind of storehouses locked away. They're actually porous. They're connected with each other, and we're interacting all the time and influencing each other's minds. Let me just give you one final example. We like to think of inventors as lone geniuses, but did you know that the incandescent light bulb, the steamboat, the hypodermic needle, these were all invented in multiple locations simultaneously. In some cases, like the light bulb, the patents submitted in different countries in the same week. So, inventors aren't just great minds. They're not great minds working independently. They're often taking the almost inevitable next step in a series of interdependent innovations. And innovation is just part of a great linked, creative human endeavor. So our bodies are not discrete. They're deeply connected with each other, and so are our minds. And I just want to spend the last minute really talking about the benefits of understanding and appreciating this connectedness. Because it turns out that when we feel less isolated, we tend to be happier, less anxious. We tend to have lower incidence of depression. And when we feel more connected to nature, we also tend to be happier, and we show more pro-environmental behaviors. So this is things like, reducing our carbon footprint, or buying sustainably, or volunteering for environmental causes. And we really need these, these pro-environmental behaviors at the moment. As I mentioned, there's a whole series of interlinked global environmental crises, climate change, biodiversity loss, and we really need to address the root cause of these problems. Often people talk about fixes at the level of institutions. So let's put a tax on carbon, or let's implement some new environmental regulation. Now, these are all important tools, but actually it's our individual behaviors. It's what we choose to buy. It's the unsustainable demand that we place on the natural world that is the root cause of driving these problems. And so we really need to address that root cause and think about changing our attitudes and our mindsets, which lead to those unsustainable behaviors. And if you think about it, actually, our institutions, our economic institutions, our justice systems, our legal systems, they're actually just comprised of our collective worldviews, both past and present. And if we want to change those institutions, we need to change our mindsets and attitudes. So really, I guess if there's a take-home message from this presentation, well, it wouldn't be a message, it would be a feeling. And it's that feeling of interconnectedness, that feeling of awe and enjoyment that we get in joining and feeling connected to the world. And actually that these big global problems that can seem so daunting, that the solutions lie within us right now. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I'll look forward to, if there are any questions. I don't know if there's a facility. It might be on Facebook, but if not, I'd be very happy for you to drop me a line. It's always good to have new ideas and suggestions. And also, there's this book here that kind of covers some of the topics that I've discussed. And yeah, check it out if you think it's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was fascinating. So it seems as though we're legacy creatures carrying around parts of our forebears and previous creatures that lived before us, that we're sort of intermingled with other species. We're chimera, and our minds aren't even our own. And as we sort of retreat into this kind of global hibernation in a way, where we're all separating ourselves from individuals, it gives us some time to think about the nature of our co-dependence, and there's a chance to recalibrate society maybe slightly differently when we emerge. I just sort of wondered if you had any kind of final tips as to how we might go about that kind of recalibration.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't have the answers, but I mean, I think it's an excellent question, and I think we have an opportunity, as you outline. You know, the system has been, the socio-economic system has been, you know, perturbed in a huge way, and you know, we're likely to suffer an economic recession, a global recession after this pandemic crisis is over. But there's an opportunity to reconfigure that system in a way which is much more progressive in terms of environmental impacts and tackling some of these global problems. But I think we need to recognize that the system can be locked in and may reconfigure in very much a similar way unless we can get in there early with a new narrative and a new, you know, some new interventions that will reduce some of those issues, you know, the amount of carbon that we put into the atmosphere, the, you know, pollution levels, and also the mental health issues that we faced. So I guess I'm optimistic that, you know, although, you know, social distancing is a silly term, I think, because obviously we want to be physically separated, but actually we all realize how hugely important it is to maintain that social connectedness. And I think people are devising new ways to do that, and to do it in a way that doesn't always involve, you know, jetting across the world and creating huge carbon emissions. So I think there's some potentially positive lessons that we'll learn from this this crisis as well.
Right, we need to reset for the next session now, Tom.
Great.
So thanks a million.
Thank you.
Can you sort of let people know again sort of where they can get your book from?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, if you want to drop me a line about anything, then it's t.oliver@reading.ac.uk. And the book's called The Self-Delusion, the surprising science of how we're connected and why that matters. So The Self-Delusion. And yeah, I mean, obviously go to your local bookshop if you've got one, because that's the best place. Or if not, yeah, other retailers should have it, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Look forward to the rest of the day.
We
Cheers.
will reset the room and see you in a few minutes to talk about empathy. Back in 2006, Barack Obama made a memorable speech in which he said, "It's time to address the empathy deficit." Well, we all know what happened next. I've been alarmed by studies in the US where Sarah Conrath at the University of Michigan has found that college students are 40% lower in empathy than 30 years ago, with the most marked decline in the past 10 years. Causes may include a decline in reading actual books, particularly fiction, people living alone more, the ring on your doorbell coming from Amazon or Uber Eats rather than from a neighbor, and the anonymity of online social platforms that allow us to demonize others. Meanwhile, documentary filmmakers often use the word empathy to define their practice, and Chris Milk called VR, virtual reality, the ultimate empathy machine. We clearly need to address the empathy deficit, but how and using what tools? To help us navigate this quagmire, we have three people who've thought about it a lot: Katrin Hyman, Gabor Simonovitz, and Mandy Rose. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in turn, and they will speak for about 8 minutes or so. Of course, you can post questions for our moderators, and we will address these questions after everyone has spoken. So we'll start with Katrin Hyman. She is assistant professor at the Interacting Mind Center at Aarhus University in Denmark, where she's researching neurocinematics. So that is cognitive studies of moving images. And she's done particular research into film and documentary and their ability to evoke empathy. So Katrin, can you share some of this research with us?
I will. So now I just start my presentation for you. I hope that this works. Like that. Can you see that? Yes. Okay. So I called my presentation form in documentary film, or how to best create a lasting empathetic response, because Mark told me that this is the question I should answer. But I have to admit that the discussion around what empathy is in cognitive science is very large, and I cannot really follow up on that here. So what I decided to do is to very quickly tell you what I think documentaries might want to do, some of them, right? Because we can't talk about everybody. And what I think that is that you have to put a thin red line just in between immersion and reflection. And what I mean with that is, like, a documentary shows us a world that we don't know, right? So it has to somehow transport us effectively into this world. It has to be immersive in a certain aspect. But it doesn't want to be propaganda, right? So it also has to give us the possibility to reflect on it. And funnily enough, these two different things, because with reflection you need a distance, while with immersion you want to dive in something, they have a parallel in the form or in the representation of a documentary, in my opinion. And that is, for immersion, the documentary has to basically hide itself as a form, right? It has to make us forget the screen, almost as if there is no like borders to the screen. While for reflection, it might actually be very helpful to actually show, oh, how is this done here? And of course, VR, for example, is much more immersive than film, but film varies still, I think, on these two dimensions, depending on which film we are looking at. And my research, and depending on the forms that it uses. And my research actually was looking into what film-specific devices like camera are montage contribute in this. And I shortly will start with showing you some of my PhD research that I did in Italy in the lab of Vittorio Gallese. It's in the first study we did there, we actually followed the hypothesis that camera movements that are creating pictures close to what we know from natural vision, such as maybe the Steadicam, are strengthening immersion and transporting the audience into the filmic world. And I just shortly would like to demonstrate you what I mean with this. Most of you will know this film, right? It's not a documentary, obviously. Alfred Hitchcock's Notorious. You see this beautiful woman. She gets asked by the beautiful man up that she kisses right now, that she falls in love with, to actually help him on a spy mission and get into an affair with this bad guy that you see in the left corner down there. And the very important thing in this movie is the key that you also see on this poster that she has to steal to get to some documents. And I will show you a scene now out of the movie where the Steadicam is used. And I know I have to see that again, how that works. Videos. There is no video of mine in here. There's like, I think, a technical slip mark. Do you hear me? Well, maybe I can't do that like that. So what I have to do instead is tell you about this. So in this scene, the camera basically walks with us through the house, and you see her standing in a room, coming to the room, seeing the bad guy being in the bathroom, and so she tries to walk. She sees the key lying on something, and the camera basically is moving slowly towards the key with the Steadicam, and gives the impression almost as if she would reach out for the key. And just when you're almost there, the camera flips around and you see her still standing in the door, and you have to go through the whole tension of it again. So I wanted to show you this scene to show how this really transports you sometimes into a character of the movie, which might arise some empathy, if we want to call it. Now, how can you test something like that with neuroscience? So what I was looking into in my PhD research were the mirror neurons. Some of you might have heard about that. These are neurons that have been first found in the motor cortex of these animals. That is the region of the brain that helps you to plan your actions. And so basically the researchers found that in the 90s that there are some cells that react when you plan an action and do this action, but that also react that also help when you actually see somebody else performing the same action. And therefore they have been called first monkey see, monkey do neurons, and later mirror neurons, which relates to the discussion around them, saying like, do they actually help us to simulate the actions but also the feelings of others? And our question was, can actually these mirror neurons do they show a different reaction when you film a scene with a Steadicam? And so we measured that by EEG using a certain feature of these neurons, because they all fire together when they are not active, and this synchronous firing is very easy to detect on the scalp. Which I can't go into in details right now, but we were using this, and basically then we were looking at how does the brain react when I show you the absolute same scene by four different cameras. So in one scene we had a still camera, in one scene we had a zoom camera, in one scene a dolly camera, and in the last scene a Steadicam. And again, I wanted to show you a video, but unfortunately I can't see these videos here, so I cannot show it to you. What the video that we showed was a person standing in front of a table and grasping an object. Right, it's a very unfilmic, basically, not something that you can have a lot of empathy for, maybe. But these are the stimuli, of course, that you use in a very strict lab setting. What did we find? So basically, what our EEG data indicates was that the Steadicam is activating the mirror neurons stronger than a dolly camera, right? A camera that moves on tracks, so very, very steady, not having any movement in it. Or a zoom camera, which is maybe the thing that is less natural to our own vision, right? So we can zoom something towards us, maybe in our imagination meanwhile, but not naturally. And we could really see that actually in the data, that there was a stronger activation of the mirror neurons for the dolly camera. We still had a question, and that was, after the study, is that due to the scene looking more natural to us? So do we actually simulate the action of the person that we see in the scene, right? The person grasping an object? Or can we actually think about that we might simulate the action of the cameraman, right? The dolly camera. Can we actually walk with somebody through the picture, as I attempted to say it with the Notorious movie, right? And so we repeated the whole experiment, taking out the actor. So we only filmed an empty room with 3 different cameras. And interestingly enough, our data indicated that it's actually the action of the cameraman that results in a activation of the mirror neurons, in a stronger activation of the mirror neurons for the steady camera, which is a very interesting finding when it comes to that. It's something like a neurocorrelate of this simulation. Now I promised that I would also shortly talk about the montage. Here I also only present one of the many studies that we did. This is a study about the 180-degree rule. So there's a rule of thumb in editing that when you cut between two scenes, between two angles showing the same scene, cutting between two cameras, right, pictures, then you should stay on the green side of what you see right now. So you shouldn't jump with the camera on the other side of the room and cut to that perspective, because that's maybe something that is very unnatural for us to do. So it would be like jumping around to see something else and confusing the viewer. And we again wanted to see, can you actually see that in the brain, that there's a difference between these two things? So yeah, here is the movie again that you can't see as a movie, but you can see a still, because I didn't want to see the movie. I show the movie. So these two people are giving an object to each other, and then they had once a 90-degree cut and once a 180-degree cut. And then we again had the results for the mirror neurons. And interestingly enough, so you have to know another detail. Mirror neurons actually are normally selective to the side of to the side where when you see something is happening. So when somebody is actually taking something with his right hand, then the mirror neurons in my left hemisphere would be stronger activated than the mirror neurons in my right hemisphere, because my left hand is represented, my right hand is represented in my left hemisphere. That's good. But what you have to know is that for in this instance, we could actually see that when you jumped across the line, that this preference of one hemisphere was being lost, as if the brain would suddenly not understand anymore what was left and what was right, if you want to put it very metaphorically, right? And we could also see that the edit blindness that we normally have, so we normally we often don't see an edit, right? If you let people tap edits, like in a movie, they miss a lot. That this edit blindness was diminished according to the signal of the brain when you had to jump across the line. So both of these studies are basically showing that you can use camera movements and edits to modulate the transparency of films, right? So how much do I actually realize of the camera here? But of course, none of these studies were specifically about documentaries, right? They were about fiction films, if at all, maybe just like very boring scenes, right? And I hope that Mandy is getting later into something much more interesting there. But what about documentaries specifically? So I want to finish my presentation with just showing you something about my last study that I did together in cooperation with Christian Suhr and in the MA class of Visual Anthropology in 2017 and 18. It was a class that we taught together, and the students developed the experiment together with us. It's an experiment using an existing movie, so a bit more into the real world. It's called Manakamana, and it's done by Stephanie Prey and Pathologizing from the Sensory Ethnographic Lab. And it's actually a movie showing people riding a cable car between two villages and a temple place in Nepal. And the specificity of this movie is that it uses long takes all the time. And there is a strong theory in ethnographic filmmaking about the long take. And here are the hypotheses that we looked at. So it has been very early already hypothesized that long takes create a very special presence. So they might give us a continuity of space and time that we normally don't have in film when it's cut. They might also create production thoughts and therefore meta reflections, right, for the reflection side. So what about how is this movie made? Things like that, I mean. And the most sophisticated theory was out there by David McDougall. He said, like, well, if you see a long take, first you react to it like you normally would, you orient in the scene. Then, however, because we have a habit with movies and we are used to edits, we get kind of like bored or maybe annoyed even by the fact that there is not coming a long take, an edit, but that it keeps being this long take. And And at a certain point, we might actually overcome this boredom and annoyance and this withdrawal of attention that you might also have, like mind wander or something, and go back to this movie. And what he says then is that we enter in a very specific mode of free viewing, in which the attention of spectators wanders freely and independent thoughts and meta thoughts arise. And he says this is maybe the condition to see and judge for yourself without interruptions or filmic manipulation, which might be exactly the thin red line that we want to achieve. So what did we do to test that? We had, on one hand, we took two scenes out of the movie that were two long cuts, right? Put them together, and then we created a stronger manipulation where we cross-cut between these two scenes. And we did then microphonological interviews with the participants of this experiment about what they precisely experienced when watching these 4-minute excerpts out of the film. And we also did some eye tracking that I don't talk about today. Because I just find the preliminary findings of these interviews extremely interesting. So the non-edited versions seem to foster, and that's the first thing that comes out very clearly, a stronger memory of content. So when you have a long take, you actually remember more. And maybe that is because you don't get interrupted. So participants were actually saying like, well, it was cutting back and forth, so I couldn't hold my thoughts, right? So I couldn't follow up my thoughts. So in the interviews, they also can't remember everything that they actually thought and experienced. The second thing was that in participants were looking at these people riding the cable cars and were making up stories for them, right? In both versions. So these two people, maybe they go to a wedding or whatever, right? However, in the non-edited versions, they didn't close these stories. So they would say, oh, maybe they're going to the wedding. Maybe, no, they look a bit too sad. Maybe it's something else. And they came up constantly, more than in the cut versions, with new stories, as if they couldn't replace the people on the screen for them, right? We could also see often a participatory presence. So they often said like, it was annoying. I couldn't see who was behind me. So as if their whole body was transported into the movie, right? They were not so much thinking about how what intentions had the movie makers for the movie. So why did they do this in this way or something? However, they had production thoughts in the sense that they were thinking, are we allowed to see this? Do the people know that there's a camera here or not? And they reported less boredom and annoyance, which is actually funny when you think about that they look at the same scene for a long time. So this study basically showed that the long take might be one way to a lasting empathetic response, I would say now. And this is where I wanted to stop with this little brief glimpse in my work, and thank again Vittorio, that I think about a lot in these days. He's in the zone in Italy where it's really bad right now. And Christian Suhr, and 3 of my wonderful students, Andreas, Mick, and Federica. Wanted to stop with this little brief glimpse in my work, and thank again Vittorio, that I think about a lot in these days. He's in the zone in Italy. It's really bad right now. And Christian Suhr, and 3 of my wonderful students from there.
Great, Katrin, thank you very much. It's really encouraging, because sort of my takeaway from this is that yes, it is, as a content creator, it is possible to achieve empathy through the view we create, and even to the extent that you can have a greater empathetic effect by using different techniques. And it's very, very rare for members of the creative community, to have any kind of clear data or research that informs this. So can I ask you where you're at in your research and where you are publishing your research, in case anybody wants to start following that?
The EEG work is work that is mostly already published. We are working on 2 more more studies, but so that is published actually in neuroscientific, neurocognitive journals, and you'll find it on the website when you Google my name and Aarhus University. And the interview data is not yet published. It's a really new study, so we're just writing it up now. Yeah, and right now I'm actually working a bit more broader in a new project where I'm looking in general what visual arts, can visual arts have a transformative effect on society and individuals. And it's a big Horizon 2020 project that we just started in February. It's very exciting. I think it's called Artis, and we will be publishing a lot in there, I hope. Do you hear me still? Okay. No, I can't hear Mark. Yeah.
Hi there.
Yeah.
Hello. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Katrin. Next, we're going to hear from Gabor Simonovic, who is Assistant Professor in Political Science at the Central European University in Budapest. One of the focuses of his research is on prejudice, and he can provide us with some fascinating insights as we try to create media that we hope will be able to challenge prejudice. Okay, Gabor, over to you.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for the invitation, first of all. Just putting up my slides. So the title I chose for my presentation is Enhancing Empathy in the Selective Audience. So much of what I'm gonna be talking about is this seeming paradox that I assume documentary makers are also facing, that we are trying to, both as artists and scholars, we are trying to produce content with the goal of changing people's minds. But at the same time, we also want to target people who are the most prejudiced against the groups towards whom we want to foster empathy. So this creates this tough place to be, that you want to convince people to engage with content that they otherwise wouldn't, because specifically because they are prejudiced. So I wanted to just talk briefly about the place I'm coming to approach this. I'm a political scientist, and I do a lot of studies on prejudice, and in particular, I've designed and implemented experiments seeking to reduce it. And one thing that I want to emphasize, that maybe that's interesting for those not coming from this academic environment, is that me and my colleagues have also tried to pay attention to how can we honestly evaluate the extent to which these experiments work. So I just wanted to give you an overview of the process of how these studies work. So basically, this consists of 3 parts. First is it's a theory that we use to design some intervention, and then we try to design a study to evaluate the effect of this intervention. And there is a lot of issues involved with each of these steps. So first of all, we are trying to use theories that could guide how to produce content that could persuade people to be less prejudiced. But unfortunately, these theories are either very vague, or they don't really provide very specific guidance on how to translate them into intervention. So one example that's probably one of the oldest theory of prejudice is from Allport, which is called social contact, which basically says that if you brought people together from different social groups and facilitated some conditions in which they can work together and they can communicate with each other in a respectful way, that would reduce prejudice between these members of the different groups, which is a very sensible theory, but it's kind of unclear how you would use this theory to actually reduce prejudice. So obviously, as a researcher or even as a policymaker, you can't just shuffle around people and force them to interact with people they otherwise wouldn't. So usually, I think most researchers start really from the point of designing some interventions where they kind of base their ideas on some notion of some theoretical relationship between something and prejudice, and try to distill these ideas to practice. And then when you do that, and I'm going to go through one specific intervention that I've done, instead of dealing with these theoretical nuances, it's often the case that we are trying to navigate trade-offs of feasibility, scalability, and most importantly, which is typically the biggest challenge, is that we need to design interventions that subjects are into. So basically, like if your stimulus in an experiment is a video, you need to make it entertaining enough for subjects that, as in people that participate in the experiment. So you need to make them entertaining enough for them not to tune out. Or if your intervention is a form of gameplay, then this game just cannot be boring for the subjects, because otherwise it just cannot have any impact on their attitudes. And so the third step is the evaluation. And so, as I said before, this is typically done through experiments. So that basically means that using some incentives or encouragement, some individuals are exposed to some form of game or entertainment, and then these people are randomly assigned to a group that's exposed to this, and then after the fact, we somehow measure their attitudes and compare them with a comparable group that wasn't exposed to this content. And then one issue that arises is that if you want to make some reliable inferences on whether or not these interventions help, then we really need a large and diverse set of testers. And then that's typically not done even for large programs run by NGOs or governments. So I wanted to give you one example from my own works. This is actually a paper co-authored by Gábor Kézdi, a colleague of mine from Michigan, and Péter Kardos, who's at New Jersey. So this was a pretty successful experiment where we were building on the theory of perspective taking, which basically posits that prejudice can be reduced if we facilitate it for individuals to see the world from the point of view of some others. And in this particular context, we were interested in prejudice against the Roma minority in Hungary, and we were testing some online game, specifically a choose your own adventure game, among a sample of Hungarian adolescents. So basically, we designed this game based on an existing choose your adventure book in which the reader or participant was making choices that had an effect, had an ostensible effect on how the narrative unfolded. And then basically we encouraged people to play with this game online, and then for some people we didn't make this game available, and then after 2 weeks and 2 months, we surveyed these people and compared how prejudiced they were against the Roma minority, and then pretty surprisingly for us, even we found large and persistent reductions in their prejudice levels. And so after we did this, we're like, this is great. From now on, we can just do this, and we can design and implement these successful and also quite cheap interventions. And then the next thing that we did was to use a pretty similar intervention, which was a mobile app developed by the UNHCR. And this was an app that allowed users to simulate what it was like for Syrian refugees to get out of Syria during the civil war. And so we thought that this is great. This is actually much better than our own game because it was developed by professional app developers. And so all we had to do was to find a sample of people to whom we could advertise the app. And then we basically, the study that we ran was, again, to send an invitation to use this app to a pretty big sample of individuals. The study was run in the Netherlands. And then, so for pretty much the same design, we found that only a tiny fraction of the invited individuals utilized the app. So we basically asked around 2,500 people to try the app, and about 25 of them did, so about 1%. And so that also clearly led to the app not having any effect on attitudes towards refugees, and also attitudes towards policies that the Dutch government was considering in the context of the refugee crisis. So basically what this example showed that we were trying to use this professional developed app that was designed specifically to enhance empathy towards a group, and then this group of people that we targeted with them was just not very interested in that. So that leads to a bunch of trade-offs, and this is what I wanted to close with. So when we design these experiments, we need to make these decisions all the time. So first of all, we need to navigate a trade-off between theory and practice. So, and it's kind of a weird place to be as a researcher because your goal is just because of the way the academia works, you are incentivized to publish papers. So you're basically encouraged to conduct studies that speak to some broader theoretical debate, and so you want to tie your interventions to some theory, but a lot of the times, but when you take theories at face value, they just don't work because of the ways practicalities constrain what you can do. So one way this plays out is that the intervention that you use, on one hand, you want to make it as persuasive as possible. So in the case of this refugee app, it's at least to me, it seemed to be the case that it was designed with a very explicit goal of persuading people that refugees in Syria was in a terrible place, and it was just utmost importance for every person to get involved in this issue and try to help. But maybe because of that, it wasn't particularly entertaining. And so there was this trade-off that maybe the kinds of things that would persuade people about changing their minds are so not entertaining for them that they just tune out. So it just can't really work. And then the last trade-off, and this is more this is more something that pertains to the way we select the kind of research projects that we that we engage in, is that we need to make these interventions quite context specific. So there could be something that works in Hungary but not in the Netherlands. There could be something that works in a democracy but not in an autocratic setting. So inevitably, the successful interventions that I know of are typically very much tied to the local context, and precisely because of that, it seems that it's tough to replicate them in other settings. So it's not the case that we design some archetypical intervention that we can that we can implement everywhere. It's more like we do a bunch of studies that are very much site-specific, and when we can try to learn from that, aggregating up the information that we get. So this is what I feel like the way forward is, that we should, science in general should switch to a more bottom-up approach, where we try to encourage researchers in different social contexts to design interventions that are inspired by the local context, and then we need to learn what works and what doesn't, and maybe if some patterns emerge that can inform our theories. Another, and I mean, maybe that's the fourth time I say that, but I really want to emphasize it, is that it really is key to design content that's entertaining, and we just need that, because because in the studies that I've seen, and both those that I implemented and those that I read about, it seemed like the entertainment value of this content was really the bottleneck, and it's just not possible to create persuasive appeals without taking the perspective of our subjects and imagine whether they would like to engage with that content. And then maybe one way this could be done is to create more cooperation between scientists who are really good at evaluation and artists who are good at creating engaging content, and last but not least, people who work in marketing, who are really good at grabbing the attention of people. So I think that these three things are typically treated separately, and these people don't interact as much as they should, but more cooperation between these domains, I think, could really lead to very valuable insights. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Gabor. So it's what you said. So it seems to me that everyone agrees that it is possible to create media that evokes empathy, and this can lead to changes in attitude, and you can demonstrate that works in that environment, but when you leave that lab environment, it becomes much more difficult. And then the key there is, how do you get to those people whose minds you want to change? Maybe the answer is that you need to sort of understand them better, what appeals to them, in order to be able to create the message in the manner that they will find sort of most entertaining and easy to assimilate. Well, next, at this stage, we had hoped to include Joan Llobera, who works at the intersection of virtual reality and cognitive sciences in Barcelona. But the practices of the social lockdown has got in the way of that. But I would love to include him in a future conference that we put on at CBH Docs, because his work is incredibly fascinating. But Mandy, who is our next speaker, is familiar with his research, and she will refer to that in her talk. So Mandy Rose is Professor of Documentary and Digital Cultures at the University of West of England in Bristol. She's also investigator of the Virtual Realities Immersive Documentary Encounters project, which interrogates the application of virtual reality in nonfiction. She's also co-convener of the IDOC Symposium, one of the most stimulating events on the documentary calendar, which was due to commence tomorrow, but of course now it's being. So Mandy, maybe could you, is that still the plan, to postpone? Is there any update?
Yeah. Yeah, we certainly hope to bring IDOC, to reconvene IDOCs in the autumn, and we'll be keeping people posted on that.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. So yes, do you now want to sort of get into your
presentation? Sure. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mark. And thanks for the invitation. It's a really interesting program you've put together. So I'm finding my slides. I'm just seeing me rather than my slides. Ah, that's more like it. Cool. Yeah, so what I'm going to do now is contextualize the empathy discussion, put it in the context of documentary, but also in the context of virtual reality, and raise some critical questions about the preoccupation around empathy that's been going on, that's going on at the moment, both in documentary and in a wider cultural context. I've got a rather wordy presentation. Forgive me for too many words on screen. It seems to be my reaction to the current crisis, to feel I need to see the words in front of me. So I'm going to spin through that. So as Mark said, I'm co-investigator on the Virtual Realities Project, which is an interdisciplinary study of virtual reality documentary. Oh, I see. I'm just moving on. So yeah, this is a project led by Kirsten Cater at the University of Bristol, who's a computer scientist. The other co-investigator is Danai Stanton-Fraser, who's an experimental psychologist from the University of Bath. And we're working with 3 research associates, Chris Bevan, Dave Green, and Harry Farmer. It's a 2.5-year project, here's our overarching research question, which really asks, about the value of virtual reality for documentary. To what extent can virtual reality take forward documentary's mission for storytelling about our shared world? And as we were writing the proposal for this project, we were engaging not least with the context that had been created by, to a large extent, by this TED Talk that came out in 2015, now somewhat notorious TED Talk by Chris Milk, who just made the virtual reality 360-degree film Clouds Over Sidra with money from the UN. And this talk, which has now been seen by 1.6 million people, seems to have proved really influential on the growth of the use of VR by humanitarian groups, in documentary, in journalism. And Milk's claim that the VR platform would deliver this promise of empathy. We can see here, for example, Facebook's VR for Good initiative, through which quite a number of really interesting projects have been supported. Subtitle, leveraging VR and 360 film to drive meaningful social change. So we can see all the expectations around this idea of the empathy machine, that not just that it would provoke feeling in people, but also move on to a kind of next stage of actually driving change. And I think we have to contextualize this preoccupation with empathy, this discourse around empathy in documentary, in that wider context that Mark referred to, this kind of wider context of a preoccupation with the empathy deficit. And an idea that, there's an idea which has grown that empathy itself could provide a solution to a wide range of social ills, social challenges, and in particular to looking to building empathy as a way of building cross-cultural understanding, as Gabor has shown in the projects he's been discussing. And obviously the challenge in making that happen is that the evidence shows that we empathize most with those who are most similar to us, in and close to us in space and time. So it's a challenge to provoke that, to engender that kind of feeling. And then if we think about empathy in relation to documentary, we can think about empathy as having to do with what we might think of as the ethics of privilege of the viewer, of the witness position of the viewer of a documentary. And it's about, thinking about empathy is thinking about how people negotiate that privilege. What do you do with that privilege, that seeing material on screen? And then in the last sort of decade or so within documentary, we've also been seeing this kind of turn towards impact, this requirement in some cases by funders that documentaries don't just raise topics for discussion, for thought, for dialogue, but also actually make change in the world around us beyond changes in how we think. So there's another kind of context, and I guess I think about empathy here as, you know, the kind of metaphor of the Good Samaritan, that the expectation is about seeing and then acting, that actually the requirement of the viewer in this context, the viewer, is to actually move from a position where they see to one where they're willing to actually take action. So, you know, why has VR documentary provoked these ideas about empathy? And I think we can see that this is really grounded in presence, in the offer of, you know, the offer that virtual reality gives us through the sense of presence, to feel as if we are virtually proximate to people in space and time. So it bridges that problem of empathy being something we feel for those around us, and offers the possibility we might feel that for people at a distance, experiencing them as close to us in VR documentary. But thinking about Chris Milk's claim for VR as the ultimate empathy machine, I'd also raise some problems with that claim. The first one is this problem of techno determinism, the idea that technology itself will deliver a societal outcome. And though, yes, we can look at ways that, say, film, as Katrin was discussing, might have empathy effects, but we can't expect a platform to deliver those. It's human purpose, it's craft, it's intention, it's design that might deliver those things. There's also a problem, I think, around empathy, where a whole lot of different emotions with quite distinct kind of characteristics get conflated. You know, there's sympathy, there's pity, there's compassion, and then there's also the problem of projection, of whether one is actually feeling like the person one is supposedly empathizing with, or whether one is just bringing one's own kind of emotional baggage to a situation. And finally, I'd raise a problem that was raised by a British academic, Kate Nash, in a really interesting 2018 article called Virtual Reality Witness. And this is the risk that Nash talks about of improper distance. This is a risk that a virtual reality scenario can make you feel as if you are next to someone, in a sense that actually you forget how far away you are, how different your life circumstances are. You feel some kind of sense of likeness, where actually feeling that sense of proximity really isn't appropriate, and what you need to be doing is thinking about your own privilege vis-a-vis the material or the person that you're seeing in VR. So within our study, within our research project Virtual Realities, Danae Stunton-Fraser and Harry Farmer undertook a piece of empirical research looking at the empathy machine claim by looking at audience responses to Clouds over Sidra. Empathy itself is hard to measure. So, like as Gabor was mentioning, they looked at prejudice instead. The idea being that if you empathize with someone, that may break down your prejudices in your reaction. And the interesting thing for the study, one interesting thing is that actually there are well-established frameworks for measuring prejudice. So within that study, 130 plus people watched Clouds over Sidra, and those participants were split into two groups. One group watched it within a head-mounted display, and the others watched the film recut so that they could see it on a flat 2D screen. And then those two groups were also split between, therefore, those who had a sense of agency, that they could look around within the 360 scenario within the headset, and the others who had a fixed point of view. What was measured within the study were three facets. Explicit prejudice was measured through a questionnaire, which examined attitudes towards Arab and Muslim people. Implicit bias was studied through Harvard's well-established implicit association test, and also to look at not just the feeling of the viewer, but also the potential pro-social aspect. The study looked at whether people were willing to donate or to sign up to an email list run by a Muslim charity for Syrian refugees. I'll whip through the findings. I guess people can look in more detail at the recording to look at the charts and what they show. But across all three areas that were measured, implicit prejudice, explicit prejudice, and the donation, effectively, our team found no difference between the viewers who were experiencing Clouds over Sidra as an immersive 360 experience, and those who experienced it as a flat screen experience. There was no effect on implicit prejudice, either in the experiment or in the follow-up sessions, which were 2 weeks or so later. Nor was there any effect on explicit prejudice, and neither did they find any effect on the amount donated. There was no difference between the inclination to donate or to sign up to the email list in that from the people who were in the headset or saw the Clouds over Sidra on a flat screen. In other words, in this empirical research, we found no evidence to back up the claims for Clouds over Sidra, the VR documentary that engendered the empathy machine claim. There was no evidence that the immersive situation had any more effect than the flat screen situation. But having said this, I'm not disputing that there are studies in VR in labs, in university labs, that have shown some success in producing empathy effects. Yes, as Mark said, we expected Juan Lebera to join us, and he works in the event lab at the University of Barcelona, run by Mel Slater. And they've been exploring the potential of perspective taking in VR across a number of studies. Super interesting one that I think Juan was going to talk about, in which somebody undertaking therapy has the experience of being embodied as the analyst, as Sigmund Freud, looking at themselves, and they actually found this really did have an impact on people's sense of compassion, of empathy for their own experience. But then I think of particular interest is this study from 2018, where men who were had been the perpetrators of domestic abuse had an experience of being embodied as a woman in a virtual reality experience, and being subject to a verbal aggression from a male avatar within that experience. And this study has had significant shown a significant evidence of lowering reoffending in these men who've undertaken domestic violence, and has been picked up on by the Catalan government, and also now I know the British government discussing this work, building on this work. So there've been some really interesting work here. So I'm not disputing these empathy effects in these lab studies. However, what the questions I would be asking here are about the wish to transpose these studies from the lab into the documentary context. I think there are questions to ask about this. One, and I guess Gabor has been discussing these challenges. Is it possible to generate similar effects in documentary? And is it desirable to do so? You know, is it appropriate for documentary, a creative practice, to adopt scientific methods to change minds or behaviors? And then an associated question, which is, are documentary producers equipped to deal with the ethics of such undertakings? If we imagine the lab situation, those studies will have gone through, rigorous thinking, rigorous testing, university ethics protocols and frameworks. They're very carefully framed to make sure there aren't any harms to the people who take part. And then finally, I would end with some wider questions about empathy and VR documentary. And what I would ask is, what does our preoccupation with empathy mean for does this preoccupation with empathy have implications for what kinds of work get made? If we think about empathy, if we focus on empathy, do we stay very close to human subjects, and in particular, do we fail to ask about the structural inequalities and the systemic problems in our societies? What happens to those questions, which are questions which documentary can and should raise? And there's a question too about whether a focus on empathy in a sense might offer the audience a position of comfort. There's a certain pleasure potentially in feeling strongly and feeling moved, and in what ways does that perhaps stop people from asking about their own privileged position? And finally, I'd end with the question about the subject of documentary, by which I mean the person or people that a documentary is about. Is what they want in taking part in a documentary to provoke our empathy? Is that what they're doing there in taking part? So what does the subject of VR documentary want from us? So that's where I'd end.
Thanks a lot, Mandy. So it seems as though the answer to my sort of starting question is, can we evoke empathy with the different types of media we create? I think it seems as though the answer to that is yes, but nothing is quite as it seems, and you can't sort of rush to assumptions here. And if anything, it looks as though there are things that would benefit for some sort of further study, because and people should definitely keep with it, because it is working, but probably we can't jump to assumptions about this. And there are things that we've learned here that might sort of help us as we sort of continue to create sort of meaningful media. But that it's an interesting field of study, but probably we need to continue doing different types of research. We had hoped to have a bit of a discussion now, but we're actually out of time. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to Katrin Garbor and to Mandy. And I hope that we will be able to continue this conversation sort of in the years to come. Bye for now. We're going to reset, and we'll see you again in a couple of minutes. So now that we are more rooted in the craft of producing work, I'd like to introduce Sara Willows, director of the MIT Open Documentary Lab, who will be talking about models of sustainability for immersive producers. You want to take it away, Sara?
Hi. Thanks, Mark, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, and thank you to CPH Docs for doing this festival, regardless of what's going on. And it's an honor to be here. As Mark said, I'm the director of the MIT Open Documentary Lab. We incubate and study new forms of documentary storytelling using emerging technologies. I'm going to start this. Today I'm going to talk about models of sustainability for immersive media. And I do want to say for this presentation, I interviewed a lot of people in the field, creators, producers, festival curators, to really hear from them how they're staying afloat and what their models are. So that's what this is based on. And I'm going to provide 3 case studies. And I do want to say that, you know, all these models have been developed up to this point, but with the pandemic, people are talking about what are going to be the new models. And I have total confidence that this field will survive. It attracts people who are highly adaptive and creative and always changing as the field changes, as the technologies change, as the funding changes. So I am optimistic about that. You know, and why should we care? Powerful embodied experiences shift cultural, political, and social narratives. When I talk about immersive media, I'm talking about VR, AR, installations, performance. It's an interactive, it's embodied. And it has an active role for the audience and the user experience. So it's also highly interdisciplinary. It comes from film, it comes from games, it comes from art, it comes from theater. And this matters too for models of sustainability. People are looking in each of these fields for funding, distribution, exhibition, and it's all merging within this immersive field. And the other thing we have to remember is that this is new. Of course, immersive media is not new. VR is not new, but this wave and, you know, the last 5 years has really seen a movement into this field, and it's still evolving. So we'll look at sustainability up to this point. So I looked at talked to people from a bunch of different countries, and it's clear that each country and each project has its own funding ecosystem. Canada, of course, has the National Film Board of Canada and a lot of support from governments and big funds. The USA doesn't have government funding. It has foundations, it had the tech industry, a lot of private and innovative sort of spaces and incubators arising to help the field move forward. The UK also is another place, and I'm going to talk about a couple case studies there where the government is really moving into this space and including immersive media in their creative economies funds and in their cultural and regional funds. Same goes with France, and they have tax incentives that people like Atlas V take advantage of, and Spain too, and the Netherlands, Scandinavia, so a lot of government funding in Europe that's really helping the field along. South Korea and Taiwan are other areas that are emerging as key centers of creation. China too with technology. Australia has some, and even Latin America. In Colombia, they've partnered with a fund in Canada and had immersive media calls, and they're really interested in this field and moving it forward. When I talked to people, a lot of strategies came up. I suggest you take a screenshot of this. There's a lot of good ideas, and I'm going to talk about them more in depth as we go through these case studies. But you know, some of them are incubators, fellowships, residencies, artist services, memberships. A lot of that is in America. That's a key way. partners, whether it's funders, universities are becoming important funders. Co-creation is always a great method to make things sustainable and work together. Networks, collectives, international co-productions, crowdfunding, distribution plans, very important. Exhibition venues, of course, you need an audience. Tool building and selling, multi-platform, tax incentives, and of course, in-kind support, selling your skills and working on other people's projects, classic for underfunded fields. Of course, those day jobs, license fees, merchandising, training and workshops, and your reputation, doing good work, good model for sustainability, and also what we say, sweat equity and sweet equity. So the first case study I'm going to talk about is Common Ground by Darren Emerson. He is someone who started with VR and doing it just for free. And he took his skills from documentary and found them very transferable to 360 and was able to make a project. His next project got a little bit of funding from Sheffield Film Festival, 5,000. And his third project, which is this Common Ground, he really decided that he wanted to understand how he could get serious funding. When I asked him about it, he said, we weren't really in the world where we were getting grants or funding for original commissioned work. That was something I've always wanted to do. So it was around this time when he started to think about Common Ground that I kind of said to myself, I'm going to figure out how this works. It might take a couple of years, but I hope by the end of that, I'll be in a better place to get funding for the work that I want to do. So Common Ground is a model where he did that. It's a project that explores the social housing experiment in London called Aylesbury Estate. It's being regenerated, and there's a lot of controversy around it. And he's went and interviewed the people who are living there, the people who made it their community, and also looked at the archives from it. So it's a project that tells the story of the people there. It's firmly steeped in documentary practice, and so it's a good place to start. He's using the affordances of VR and spatial storytelling to talk about a space and help you better understand the issues by having that sense of presence. He's also exploring the rich archives with augmented reality that puts you can see them right in the place. So very good use of technology for documentary storytelling. So it's a good model of a documentary VR and of a model of sustainability, which I'll talk about after I show it. So I'm going to show this clip. Gotta get the video out. Start video. Here we go.
It was a really good place to bring up a family. That's why I chose to live in this area. And that's why I'd like to stay.
I don't think you'll ever find a stronger community.
Did it play?
It was a really good place to bring up a family.
Is it playing now?
It was a really good That's why I chose to live in this area. And that's why I'd like to stay. And that's why I'd like to stay.
I don't think you'll ever find a stronger community. You'll ever find a strong...
My home means an awful lot to me. You know, I've brought a family up there. My late husband died there.
Whole community is going to be wiped out from here, and our voice never been heard.
London is becoming a city for wealthy people, especially inner city London.
We need to go to make way for empty flats for foreign investors.
It seems to have, okay. There we go. Okay, so in this project, Darren received funding. He talks a lot about partnerships, partnerships with funders, some that were financial and some that were in-kind. Of course, he co-creates with his community, and there's a lot of in-kind work that we need to acknowledge. But England has really put forth a lot of funding for immersive media. So that's been key to allowing projects in England to evolve. Darren received £100,000 from the Arts Council England via Creative XR, which is a new initiative for government and industry. But he only had 4 weeks to find matching funds, 50,000. So that was a real hustle and took a lot of ingenuity. And eventually he received an agreement for funding from Story Futures, which was also being funded by the government, but hadn't yet. So a little tricky, but they did agree, and that seemed to work. And he also put in 30,000 of in-kind. So a lot of investment to make this work, and the funding happened. But he did get it, and he did get a tax credit, which was another way. So really, this model is not that different from documentary film itself. But what is different is that he then also got funding for R&D for a distribution plan. Again, because this field doesn't have an infrastructure in place, distribution plans have to be made and invented and researched and developed. So he came up with the idea of a regional tour. It's funded by the British Film Institute, and it's going to their hubs. But that was something he really had to develop himself. And so that gets back to really being strategic and committed. He's been asked to apply for other funds, and he's holding back because he knows how much work it is to put a VR documentary out there, because you're not just doing the production, you're doing all the parts of it. And staying committed to it after it's in a festival and finding those audiences. So that was a key model of sustainability for him. The next project I'm going to talk about is not a project, it's a collective. It's Marshmallow Laser Feast, and it's a London-based collective of virtual reality creators. They have a very robust model of sustainability with a lot of different methods in play. I talked to Nell Whitley, who's the executive producer there, and she talked about it being a lot of work because the production company, again, has to build this infrastructure around them. I'm going to show an example of their work so you know who they are, what they do. This is In the Eyes of the Animal, and it's a project that used LiDAR scanning to scan the bottom of a forest and from the perspective of different animals. So you get to see the invisible, what's invisible to the human eye, and also a perspective that's non-human. So I'm going to play that. See, go to videos. It's not playing, huh? Yeah. Apparently that's not working. So we will skip the video and talk about the models of sustainability. When I talked to Nell, she used a lot this word blending. And what she meant was the blending of information from one project to the next. When they did research and development, a lot of the research went into other projects, blending of funders and partnerships, blending of platforms. So that was key. And this, In the Eyes of the Animal, was funded through a festival commission. It was called Abandoned Normal Devices. And one of the things to think about is going beyond film festivals. Again, because this VR and immersive media is in so many different disciplines, thinking beyond film festivals is key for finding funding. Of course, Marshmallow Laser Feast also comes from a different path than film. So that makes sense for them. And they had another project called Tree Hugger, where you could explore the inner system of a sequoia tree. And there they were approached by several festivals to create a project. And they said, hey, will you partner with each other? Let's bring in, and they brought in 4 festivals, which brought in more money, and then also gave them the ability to show the work at different festivals, which is something people are really interested in doing. It's okay. I'll just continue. The third project is Colossal Wave. In that one, they forged an international collaboration with Canada, which allowed them to access funds in Canada. So international collaboration is another key way that people are supporting themselves and working. In France, Atlas 5 does a lot of international collaborations by bringing people on and using their services, and then getting through a tax break that France has, getting that money back to international partners. The next way is service agencies. So using their services to make videos for other people, music videos, films, ads, and using their service. That's always a way that a lot of people have to do to sort of fund this immersive media. And in America, people keeping their day jobs sometimes too is the way they do it. Another way that Marshmallow Laser Feast works is they have a lab internally, and this allows them to really research and innovate. And how they do that is they partner with universities. They then get the university expertise, but they also can co-fundraise together and apply for these research funds so that they have the time and the money to really innovate, and time and money that perhaps a festival commission or a smaller commission wouldn't allow them to do that. And then that bleeds into their other projects. And then the other thing Nell talked about was really thinking about each project as a tourable and digital asset. And so thinking about all the other ways they could tour their project or put it online for Oculus and get license fees. They talked about with Tree Hugger, how they could maybe have it move through festivals without the tree, and just really thinking about how they can adapt it, each project, to make it last and go on. A new model for them, and one that the field has been watching very closely, is their project, We Live in an Ocean of Air. This project is looking at our connection to plants and nature, and also allowing us to experience it through this VR embodied experience. And it gives us a perspective, like all their projects do, that is invisible to the human eye. And in this case, through LiDAR scanning, we get access to perspectives that we normally don't, which is a really wonderful use of VR. So I'm now going to try to play this video. Let's see if, okay, they're going to try. Okay. Okay, back. So this was an interesting model because they got the exhibition space first before they even fundraised for the project. So they worked with Saatchi Gallery, who agreed to play it, host it, and then they went out and raised money, and they had revenue sharing. So this is also something that's very interesting to people, you know, that when tickets were sold, they could also share in the revenue from that. And it's something that the field hopes will move along, and there'll become more of these opportunities. The next case study is a look at the American scene. There's a lot of American studios, and they developed originally out of that big tech interest in selling headsets and hardware and needing content. So a lot of them emerged out of there, and places like New Ink that developed, that created incubator space for them, and of course not with government funding, so it's a lot harder, and some fellowship foundation funding becomes key, and there is some of that and hope for more. As I said, you know, incubators, fellowships, and artist services become very important. There's this new space, ONCS, that's developing. It's a partnership between the Onasis Foundation and New Ink, and not only is it going to be an incubator and a place to form community and mentorship, but also an exhibition space, which a lot of people are saying is key. You know, to have the funding, you need the audience. And Kaleidoscope is another organization that has a platform for artists. It's based on a membership model, and they provide all kinds of services. They're showing your work, they're putting you in touch with funders, and just generally providing mentorship and opportunities. Sundance also provides artist services and fellowships. And then there's our own lab, MIT Open Documentary Lab. We have a fellowship program, and our co-creation studio is developing a funded fellowship program with funds that we hope to get. But regardless, we have fellows, and people come in, and a lot of projects are being incubated out of there and going on to the festivals and out into the world. So universities is another key area of funding. And Riot, of course, and is a technology company, and with 5G and what have you, is also funding projects. So the technology is still there. The next area is content and tools. As I said, big tech companies looking for content. It's not what it was, but there still is some. I talked to Yasmin Eliad at Scatter, and she talked about how now, you know, they're using sensors in their work, so they're getting some funding from companies that are selling sensors. And also the other model for them is tool building. They have this project, this tool called Depth Kit, which allows for volumetric filmmaking and using the tools that they developed through their projects to sell those. What's interesting about it is that they also have to create and are creating the community around that, because a lot of people don't know what volumetric filmmaking is. So there's a lot of training and education and network development that goes along with the selling of these new tools. And then, of course, the deal. There was a lot of hope that there would be distribution deals out of festivals like there is in film. And back in 2018, there was a lot of excitement around the deal for Spheres from City Lights. That was 7 figures, and the hope that maybe this was a change, that there would be more distribution. It hasn't quite panned out like that. But I understand that City Lights is developing other technologies, and that there might be perhaps more distribution deals in the future. The other thing where people are really looking are LBEs, location-based entertainment, and people talk a lot about different spaces that are developing for exhibition. Again, with the pandemic, as I did the interviews, people started to question that, but I think we will get back there, or we'll figure out something. maybe the headsets will develop more and become more popular, or even streaming. What will streaming experience? People talked about that. And I thought I would just show this slide. It's from the project Tree, and it's all the people that supported them. Tree is a project by Winslow Porter and Militia Zek, and it's having a tremendous impact in the field and is touring around a lot. The World Economic Forum has shown it. It's going to show it again. And you can see how many organizations and people really help to get this project along. So when you don't have big grants and governments, or these kind of things are the way that people are funding their projects and sustaining them. So what are the sustainability factors in some? Clearly the government and foundation investment, that's key. It's a lot of work coming out of England. Tech companies, they're still an important factor, especially in the United States. Selling your own tools, difficult in a field that's emerging, and not a lot of people are familiar with the tools or the processes. But again, it's a new field, and these things take time. Distribution and exhibition spaces. There's a lot of hope and interest in creating these spaces. There's some people are moving into museums, particularly the art world that seems to work in the museums, but they're not always fit or ready for them, and they don't have the infrastructure. So what are these new spaces going to look like that are really specific for immersive media? I talked to quite a few people who are even thinking about developing them and trying to get them off the ground themselves with partners. And in fact, if you think about film, in order for it to develop and have large audiences, the cinema was born, and the Nickelodeon was the first place. So it created a new space for itself. So what will those spaces be for? Immersive media. And of course, artist support is key, fellowships, incubators, services, all the ways that we can support artists themselves to do their work. And then of course, everyone's talking about what will be the changes with this pandemic and how will we respond. So those are some of the factors affecting sustainability. And what's next? Will there be more adaptability and wide adoption in the field, in festivals, in museums, in new spaces? Will there be more funders as there's more audience, more incubators and accelerators and collectives, networks and collectives, people coming together to share skills and like the Marshmallow Laser Feast, and even funding and projects. And these new spaces, will they develop? Streaming experiences, where will immersive media go within the streaming context? Those are the questions. We don't know, and time will tell. Thank you.
Hi there.
Hello.
Sorry, I'm experiencing another kind of a lag. Thanks very much for that, Sarah. I really hope that we'll be able to do this again and then see that there are some clearer kind of patterns emerging of that really do present kind of coherent sustainability models for immersive producers. But this is very helpful. And right now we're out of time. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to you, Sarah, and to all of our speakers, and to our incredible tech team, Nana, Marie, Anas, and Aska, who've been helping us fight against incompatibilities between different devices in this platform. And this platform that we're using is sort of designed more for webinars and conferences, so we're really kind of stress testing it. But you guys are doing very well. I hope the audience found it interesting, and that the sort of tech problems didn't get too much in the way of your enjoyment. So we'll see whoever can join us again on Thursday morning for The Brothers Are But Believers, and on Thursday evening for the CPH Lab pitch on Kaleidoscope. But for now, I'll wish you all farewell.